Hi, this is John Hanson, and this is another in our series of flipped classroom videos designed to give more time in the classroom for student questions and discussion. The previous video looked at the blame frame crisis in the first half of the 20th century and how that connected to a trend in art, journalism, and law to more realistically examine inequalities and their causes, and finally how all of that shaped law and policy during FDR's New Deal. This video looks at the effect of World War II on the blame frame crisis and how that crisis and changing perceptions of inequality, power, and legitimacy led many to perceive injustice in the 1960s during what became the peak of the situationist thinking about policy problems and inequalities, and how that threatened certain interests, creating what might be called a big scare, particularly among large commercial interests, and finally, how all of that heightened the effort toward creating a new blame frame in response to a blame frame crisis. We left off in the previous video considering the ways in which the trend toward realism was reflected and reinforced by the New Deal. We pick up on the morning of December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, leading to, among other things, a dramatic change in focus of FDR's administration and U.S. policy.
100 Japanese planes and a number of midget submarines took part in the attack. In an hour and 5 minutes, the battleship Arizona was completely destroyed and 4 others severely damaged. 3 other battleships and 3 cruisers suffered lesser damage. Nearly 200 planes were destroyed. In that Sunday morning inferno, the Pacific Fleet appeared to be completely immobilized by the sneak attack. Nearly 3,000 casualties added to the catastrophe. Within hours, the United States declared war.
Suddenly, because of war, it was necessary to protect the country by working hand in hand, those immense corporate producers, who had been viewed as a threat to democracy throughout much of the 19th and early 20th century, a threat to American ideals and values. But as President Roosevelt himself would put it, Dr. New Deal has been replaced by Dr. Win the War. The overwhelming first emphasis should be on winning the war. To do so would require working together and taking full advantage of the production potential of the very institutions that seem so menacing. It would also require overcoming some of the internal distrust and hostility between groups in the U.S. and replacing it with shared goals and a sense of mutuality. To build the sort of common purpose and to unite and mobilize the country, the U.S. government would need a common external enemy and common threat capable of transcending internal hostilities between factions. The stronger and less just the threat to the system, the more united and committed U.S. citizens would tend to be. In his book, Faces of the Enemy, Sam Kean used archival news footage, public service announcements, posters, and editorial cartoons to identify a series of patterns in human conflict. The strategy common to such efforts, Kean found, has been to promote a view of an enemy as a demonized, dehumanized adversary, attacking us and our most cherished and vulnerable institutions, values, and people. Before we can kill, Kean writes, we must first think our adversaries to death. Here's a short clip from the PBS documentary made about his work.
All nations use basically the same visual metaphors, the same hostile cliches to characterize and dehumanize their enemies. It's as if all these propaganda artists had gone to the same art school. The enemy is always a demon, a barbarian, the aggressor, a liar, a madman, or some vile animal that can be exterminated without regret. Before we make war, even before we make weapons, we make an idea of the enemy.
To gain a better sense of Kean's point, consider some of the posters used to sell war to U.S. citizens during World War I and World War II. Let's start with the most iconic image from that era, Uncle Sam calling for you to serve in the military. This famous image is just one of many used to try to mobilize an isolationist population not only to enlist, but also to invest and give up many comforts to support the war. This was all part of an effort by the U.S. government's Public Information Committee, which created a division of pictorial publicity in 1917 to work with some of the country's best artists to provide images that then could be made into posters and placed everywhere. The following poster illustrated nicely the strategy depicting a threatening, monstrous enemy operating according to a familiar narrative. They, the undeserving, pose a threat to us, the deserving. Posters encouraging citizens to help finance the war by investing in bonds were common, as was this theme that the enemy was coming after our women and children, more specifically, young white women and mothers and their children. Here a mother clutches her child as she reaches out for help. These themes were common. And they would continue through World War II. Again and again, a monstrous enemy was shown to be destroying our institutions and taking our liberty, our religious faith, and our women. That same theme of a vulnerable young white mother clutching and defending her frightened innocent child was common from World War I and then the Depression and Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother. In this image you can see it's been colorized, but that theme continued through World War II. These images and themes were not simply the product of a government attempting to build support on the part of the American citizenry. They were also images and system-justifying themes that many citizens were eager to absorb. In fact, well before America declared war, comic heroes had already gone to war, and comic books were producing the same sort of images and narratives. During the war, 90% of kids ages 7 to 17 were regularly reading comic books, and 50% of adults were. The comic book images and narratives tell us a great deal about the stories and attributions that many Americans yearned for. Not simply the idea that ours was a country where an immigrant could land, take a Gentile name like, say, Clark Kent, find a job, blend in, and do good, but also a conception of our enemies as obvious, malevolent, inferior, and beatable, and conceptions of ourselves as being unambiguously on the side of justice, of democracy, and of freedom, in the idea that both evil and justice came in the form of individuals, not institutions, structures, or systems. This video, which contains brief clips from several documentaries, captures some of those themes.
In 1939, the war in Europe had begun. Even though America wasn't involved yet, many superheroes were. By the end of the year, the Submariner began turning his general hatred of humanity against the Nazis in particular.
We just could all see what a menace Hitler was.
Superman's creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster thought the Man of Steel could stop the war in 2 pages. In a special story for Look magazine in February 1940, Superman simply grabs Hitler and his then ally Stalin and drops them off at the League of Nations. End of story, end of war.
In American society, we believe in instant solutions. Superheroes do that.
Well before the U.S. entered the war, superheroes weren't just waving the flag, they were wearing it. Timely Comics had the greatest anti-Nazi of them all, who burst on the scene with an unforgettable cover.
Captain America threw a smashing right cross to the jaw of Adolf Hitler. That said everything about the character. Captain America exploded on the newsstand, and sold out of his first issue.
The story begins as war is looming. FDR approves a secret project to create an army of super soldiers. Frail Steve Rogers is the first volunteer. The brilliant Professor Einstein injects him with a strange liquid. In seconds, Rogers is a perfect physical specimen, dubbed Captain America. When a Nazi spy kills the professor, the secret of the formula dies with him. So Captain America carries on alone, except for Army mascot turned kid sidekick, Bucky Barnes. In the spring of 1941, Cap and Bucky stop an unnamed Asian power from destroying the U.S. Pacific Fleet, 7 months before Pearl Harbor was attacked. When the Japanese actually did cripple that same fleet, Captain America's wrath echoed the nations. With war declared, the Men in Tights cast all restraint to the winds.
The superheroes went off to war with great gusto. Week after week, month after month, just pounding the hell out of the Nazis.
The stories had so much pro-American propaganda that you'd almost think they were subsidized by the government, but it was just, we felt we had to do that.
And then something very interesting happened, which was that comic books were included in care packages that were sent to soldiers, along with chocolate and cigarettes, and comic books became part of the standard reading material for GIs serving in the Second World War, and they liked them.
The superheroes were now in sync with the government's war effort, and comic book sales soared from 15 million a month in 1942 to 25 million a month a year later. World War II was the peak of what would be called the golden age of comics. And why not? In the comic books, the Americans always won.
During the war fever, you have some appallingly racist portrayals of Japanese, when the point was to show America destroying Japan in a comic book. Portrayals of these people as animals, as demons, is shocking.
The thing that must be said, it's important to say, about comic books, with all its good points, was one of its negative points, how racist and stereotyped it was in terms of minorities. That's what it was in those days, and I was doing it myself. The Japanese were slant-eyed, they were frothing at the mouth. Blacks ran from fights. The Germans were blonde hulks who, underneath it all, were terrible cowards. And our heroes were never very smart. Might makes right.
After victory in the Pacific and the surrender of the Japanese in 1945, America welcomed home its real-life heroes.
Superheroes begin to seem less and less appealing after the war.
Characters like Captain America, for example, no longer had a reason for being there. He served his country well. He did what he needed to do, but his time was clearly over.
At the war's conclusion, it was pretty clear to everyone that America truly was great. The U.S. was Captain America. One element of our system's superiority was its immense efficient factories. What Andrew Carnegie had done for steel and Henry Ford had done for the automobile, American manufacturers did for the war effort generally. Another element of our system's superiority were its political commitments and institutional processes which celebrated equality, freedom, participation, and the well-being of the citizenry through capitalism and democracy over the interests of the leaders. Leaders served the citizens, not the other way around. Such distinctions between the United States on one hand and the once dominant powers of Western Europe and the rising threat from Russia and Japan on the other hand were seen as the primary, if not sole, distinguishing source of the U.S.'s emergence. The values and political economic systems, not the situation of the U.S., were credited for the U.S.'s ultimate triumph in the global conflict. Perhaps that was mistaken. Nonetheless, It was the essence of America that America was selling to the world. And the U.S. would enjoy the sort of acclaim and pride and system-affirming reputation appropriate for a country that had just sacrificed immensely to save the world from evil. The great experiment had proven its mettle, but now that mettle would have to be reshaped. The wars and the war effort had had other effects. Common enemies began to make us of previous others within U.S. borders. Change in wartime roles, who did what, for example, brought inequalities and flaws in our old hierarchy-justifying scripts into stark relief. Wartime experiences altered expectations and further undermined legitimacy of traditional norms. Consider the experience of the African Americans who fought in the Great War to, in the words of Woodrow Wilson, make the world safe for democracy, only to return to the terror of Jim Crow, the KKK, continued disenfranchisement, and white supremacy.
The World War had created a new impetus and a new confidence in those writer Alan Locke called the New Negro. Thousands of blacks had migrated north to help build the instruments of war, and thousands of blacks had gone to Europe to fight in it. By the war's end, some 200,000 African Americans would serve their country in Europe in a segregated army. One all-black regiment, the 369th, would fight side by side with French soldiers as equals. In the end, the 369th spent more time fighting on the front lines than any other American unit. The men of the 369th earned an unprecedented number of French military honors, 171, Croix de Guerre, France's highest military medal. African American soldiers hoped that their patriotic service would earn them recognition, acceptance, and equality in American society upon their return.
African-American veterans returning to their towns south of the Mason-Dixon line found themselves set upon and spat upon and indeed brutally accosted.
I saw the black soldier fighting for democracy, to make the world free. And these people came back expecting the blessings of liberty and full deserts of freedom, coming back and being denied it.
There was a whole upsurge of reaction that said, if you think anything has changed because of this war, you've got a second and third thought coming.
But the outspoken black leader W.E.B. Du Bois is urging the returning veterans to fight in a new battle.
Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States, or know the reasons why. This country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. It gloats in lynching, disfranchisement, caste, brutality, and insults. By the gods of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if we do not now marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Many Southern whites responded not with a newfound appreciation for the humanity and the sacrifice and the heroism of blacks, but with a desire to recreate the hierarchy that had existed for centuries in which blacks knew their place, so to speak, and stayed in it. Following World War I, in response to the increasing expectations of blacks who had fought heroically in the war, the KKK and the terrorism it promoted reemerged.
In 1919 alone, over 90 African Americans were lynched, nearly one lynching every 4 days.
This tremendous increase in lynchings after World War I that threatened the ability of the NAACP to be an adequate spokesperson for people of color who were terrorized in many of these communities. And so White and others recognized that lynching had to become more of a priority in the campaign to protect the rights of black people.
Relief from physical terrorism was critical to all of the other rights that people would strive for, the right to vote, the right to protest. I mean, if you risked your very life by doing that, I mean, you're exposed to the possibility of a lynching. That form of terrorism was just brutal for building a movement for civil rights reform in the South.
In the North, making life better for African Americans in the early 1930s was a formidable task. As Langston Hughes said, the Depression had knocked everyone down a peg or two, and Negroes had but a few pegs to fall. The NAACP, like the rest of America, was struggling to survive.
People want to see results, and they want to feel that what they're doing is going to lead to something. And I think it was very hard for the NAACP to provide that. There was no political leverage. You know, black people in the South couldn't vote. There's not any movement forward on the main issues, anti-lynching legislation, sharecroppers getting fair prices for their labor. Things aren't changing.
For the great, great majority of Americans, the single overriding fact is the Great Depression and the need to combat that depression, the need to get the American economy rolling again. Everything else was secondary.
In November of 1922, the NAACP ran this full-page advertisement in the New York Times and other newspapers pressing for passage of the Dyer anti-lynching bill. Passed in the House of Representatives by a 2-to-1 majority, the anti-lynching bill was subsequently filibustered and defeated in the U.S. Senate. Despite the NAACP's vigorous efforts through the 1930s and the introduction of several subsequent anti-lynching bills, the U.S. Congress never outlawed lynching. Again, in World War II, African Americans were called upon to join the war effort against common enemies, and they would respond. Again, African Americans would find themselves on the front lines of the fight for freedom and democracy elsewhere in the world. Jim Crow notwithstanding, African Americans served in the military, risking and often losing their lives for this country, experiencing other cultures where segregation and racism was not the norm, and where they were treated with appreciation and respect, and achieving new status in previously unavailable roles. In some cases, they were portrayed and perceived as American heroes. This extended video clip captures some of that experience.
With the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, change had come, not just for black Americans, but for all Americans. Roosevelt's promise to keep America out of World War II could not be kept. America's machinery of war was forced into high gear. By the thousands, Southern blacks migrated north to produce the instruments of war, and thousands of black men and women would leave their segregated society to fight in a segregated army. The war would become the transforming experience of their lives.
The army at that time, it gave me a certain air about myself. I became a platoon sergeant.
We were exhibiting something that had not been shown before.
I really was proud of being in a tank battalion.
I remember nights after those guys would be engaged, and we were waiting for the guys to come back from the front lines. And you could hear that tank company come in at night. And each driver had a way of what you call gas in his truck, his tank. You could say, that's John, that's Jim, that's whoever. They took pride in what they did. They were gallant men.
As they proved their ability to fight, African American soldiers also challenged racial stereotypes. And even as they fought to end the tyranny of the Nazi occupation of Europe, they discovered another terrible face of racism.
I did happen to see it one time on a side road, our railroad truck, a railroad car, that was filled with Jews. The black soldiers, some of them cried like babies when they saw this. I did, you know. It was just beyond the thought of how a human being could do what they did to those people. And after all, the Jews, their complexion, they were Caucasians, huh? So if they did that to them, what could they do to us, huh? And we were hated and disliked by the Germans, especially Hitler. But that was things that we understood. And we just had to put it in the back burner and continue to do what we had to do.
While the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion are horrified by German atrocities, elsewhere in Europe, African American soldiers are experiencing a warmth and acceptance unknown to them at home.
The French had a certain kind of openness and warmth that they exhibited toward the minorities that was just unexplainable.
In the nightclubs of Paris, the soldiers enjoyed that acceptance, breaking one of the deepest taboos ingrained in them from childhood.
And I think that's what changed most of the black servicemen, the Negro servicemen. They found out that other people treat us different from our own people. And that's why most of us were so determined when we got back home to be treated fairly.
World War II altered the experiences and expectations of other subordinated groups as well. Native Americans played a pivotal role in baffling the enemy and maintaining secret communication during wartime. They too were celebrated for their contributions, at least briefly. Of course, many thousands of soldiers from subordinated identity groups served honorably, even if their contributions would often go unheralded. While women served overseas, their role back at home got most of the attention. The posters and photographs were particularly likely to capture white women who had left their conventional roles in the domestic sphere to take factory jobs which had traditionally been performed only by men. The fact that they would choose to behave so counter to the norms was proof not of their deviance, but of their immense sacrifice. Behavior stigmatized before the war became valorized during the war. Women of color, by the way, also served overseas and worked in factories, though their role in the labor force was considered less noteworthy, in part because they had long been associated with labor and outside the scope of true womanhood. During World War II, the categorical and hierarchical lines between men and women were blurring as the spheres grew less separate, and even the prescriptions of appropriate behavior were temporarily altered. Again, a blue-collared, denim-shirted, muscular woman was not seen as an unacceptable deviation from womanhood, but as a model to emulate. Such images of women as strong, as capable, as equal, as smart were being reproduced and celebrated in comic books as well during World War II. Wonder Woman, for instance, was every bit as powerful as Superman. She was just smarter. And her purpose went beyond fighting crime. She fought for the American values of freedom, democracy, and equality, and against ignorance and prejudice.
Everything about Wonder Woman was different.
Wonder Woman was a particularly interesting character, created by a psychologist.
Charles Moulton was really Dr. William Moulton Marston, an author, one of the inventors of the lie detector, and an early defender of comics. The Harvard-educated Marston was hired by DC as a consultant.
He believed that women were inherently emotionally superior to men, and that one day America would be a matriarchy.
Marston began the saga in 1941. As a wounded intelligence officer, Steve Trevor crash lands on the island home of the immortal Amazons. The Queen's daughter, Princess Diana, falls in love with the helpless man. Her love makes her realize that the Amazons face the same decision other isolationists and pacifists face in 1941. Try to ignore the Nazis or fight for freedom. Against her mother's protests, Diana goes back with Steve to defend America, described by the goddess Athena as the last citadel of democracy and equal rights for women.
Wonder Woman was created to promote ideals of democracy, to teach children how to fight the forces of international tyranny. You just look at her and you see the American flag.
These were unifying themes that would echo throughout our system all the way up to the White House. To rally all communities to fight for the group, leaders began to speak of intergroup equality and to call for an end to hierarchy enforcing prejudices. As President Roosevelt put it in one of his 1942 fireside chats, this whole nation of 130 million free men, women, and children is becoming one great fighting force. All of us can have that deep and permanent inner satisfaction that comes from doing the best we know how, each of us playing an honorable part in the great struggle to save our democratic civilization. In some communities, employers dislike to employ women. In others, they are reluctant to hire Negroes. In still others, older men are not wanted. We can no longer afford to indulge such prejudices or practices. After the war, and after the celebrations, as the soldiers returned home, those previously marginalized groups were pushed back to the margin again, back to their places, so to speak, and their previous roles. Segregation, prejudice, and inequality were still built into the physical and psychological structures and institutional processes of the U.S., particularly in the South.
The South to which the veterans returned is not the South they had left. The old agrarian rural South is being dramatically replaced by an urban industrial one. Signs of the new prosperity are everywhere. But for the returning black veterans, there are other painfully familiar signs as well.
I thought prejudice would be gone, or eliminated, or stopped when I got back. But I found that it was not.
I was standing out in front of the bank, waiting on it to open. And two white men were there. And one of them said, "I reckon now all the Negroes will be coming back, I guess." And the other one said, "Yep, yep, yep." And the other one said, "Well, I guess we'll have to put them all back in their places." That's what he did. And he said, "Yep, yep, yep." He answered 3 or 4 times before he stopped saying yep.
They gave us 45 days leave out of Camp Shanks, New York again. And we got in Americus, Georgia, the hometown of Jimmy Carter, ex-President Jimmy Carter. They had to change buses there. Blacks could not go in the bus station. And if you wanted to purchase anything from the snack bar, it was a window. And you would peck on that window, and this lady was open this window and sell you if she wanted to. And I tried to get her to give me a glass of water. She would never give me. She just ignored me. And I didn't go in, but I tried to lean inside and get me a cup of water. And those white people beat me till I was unconscious. I was in the Army uniform, had all these medals. And that's one thing you thought they would have respected. And they beat me until they thought I was dead, called a black undertaker, who picked me up and found I had a pulse and still breathing, and carried me to a hospital there in Thomasville, Georgia, that still exists today. And I laid there crying for 8 weeks, wishing Adolf Hitler had won the war.
Many African American soldiers thus again returned to Jim Crow segregation. Having served their country and experienced relative equality in other cultures, they returned to a country that often refused to serve them and sought to maintain pre-war hierarchies. All the sort of justifications for inequality, all the callous dehumanization, all the violence had lost any claim to legitimacy, however. After all, injustice had been defined in the war. Evil had been defined in our enemy. The group-based prejudice and the terror that we all went to war against was alive and well back home. Our enemy was us. Injustice was here in the form of the segregation, separation, dehumanization, and oppression that defined this country, particularly evident in the South. Evil was rampant right on U.S. soil, embodied in the hate-spewing proponents of race-based hierarchy and the mobs who maintained it through violence. Meanwhile, the women who had proven themselves strong and smart and capable in factories during the war were forced back to the domestic sphere afterwards to make room for the returning men. During the war, women could do it. After the war, they couldn't. During this time period, the U.S. government was admonishing other nations around the world that freedom and equality through democracy and capitalism were the answers to humankind's greatest struggles for justice, and that they needed to abide by our values and mimic our example if they hoped to participate in the progress that America represented. While some of those hypocrisies may have been tolerable in the immediate afterglow of victory, for some, the contrast between who we claimed to be and who we were becoming during the war on one hand and who we were after the war on the other was frustrating and enraging. To many, that is, America was not so great after all. For those reasons, by the late 1950s, the blame frame crisis had only intensified, a crisis that was further heightened by the delegitimization of eugenics. Let me try that again. By the delegitimization of eugenics and related racial attitudes during and after the war. One measure of how eugenics lost its legitimacy can be found in the name changes that occurred after World War II among prominent academic journals and organizations. The annals of eugenics would become the annals of human genetics. Eugenics Quarterly became Social Biology. Bulletin of the Eugenics Society became Biology and Society. The Eugenics Review, Journal of Biosocial Science. Journal of Race Development became Foreign Affairs. And the American Eugenics Society changed its name to Society for the Study of Social Biology. In short, the nature frame could no longer legitimate or accommodate the stark inequalities that remained in the U.S. It's worth noting that corporate America had thrived in terms of both profit and reputation during World War II. Indeed, our industrialized systems of mass production were credited by some with winning the war for us. Beginning in the 1960s, though, the corporation would again come under scrutiny and suspicion as a source of potential harm. So let's get to the 1960s, by which I mean to refer to the 20-year period between 1955 and 1975. That was a period when there was no dominant legitimating blame frame to justify significant and long-standing inequalities across groups, but when those inequalities remained nonetheless. In large part for that reason, the 1960s would come to represent the peak of situationism. It was during that period that social scientists were coming to see the power of situation over disposition. It's when Stanley Milgram wrote that the social psychology of the century reveals this major lesson, that it's often not so much the kind of person a man is as the kind of situation in which he finds himself that determines how he will act. Throughout the 1960s, that basic psychological assumption that people are more like balls than sticks, that their behaviors and life conditions are more a reflection of their situation than their disposition, would begin to find its way into legal theory, law, and policy. In 1962, Rachel Carson, for example, completed her eye-opening and path-breaking work, Silent Spring. In it, she called attention to our situation, that we are pouring chemicals into our environment, and that our environment is pouring those chemicals back into us. As she warned, contamination of various kinds has now invaded all of the physical environment that supports us: water, soil, air, and vegetation. It has even penetrated the internal environment within the bodies of animals and of men. It comes from many sources: radioactive wastes from reactors, laboratories and hospitals, fallout from nuclear explosions, domestic waste from cities and towns, chemical waste from factories, detergents from homes and industries. To understand the significance of Rachel Carson's work, it's helpful to understand the context in which she wrote and the reaction that her book received. This video contains clips from several sources.
Pesticides weren't always thought to be harmful. To the contrary. In 1947, Time magazine carried an advertisement claiming DDT was good for people, homes, and farms. It took 20 years before scientists realized how dangerous it was.
It begins with the war-born development of DDT. This diabolical weapon of modern science saved millions of humans, but killed billions of insects. Man, with this newly discovered force, has at long last gained the upper hand in our age-old struggle. Just like these mosquito larvae, it came from laboratories where top scientists from famous universities and from industrial and government organizations collaborated to develop something new and different. They succeeded. They perfected Pestroy, the most effective weapon man has ever wielded against insects. It is so easy to apply because of a new efficient dispenser package. All people have to do is to press the patented top like this. It's a handful of concentrated death.
From 1945 to 1955, annual pesticide use on farms went from 125 million pounds to over 600 million. Soon, government agencies began treating even the suburbs with DDT.
People thought it was a good thing because they got action in solving a problem as they conceived it. They were, for example, complaining about mosquitoes, and if the spray truck came down the street, they were told to just stay indoors for a few minutes and everything would be all right. So you had the government endorsing a product, and you had the chemical industry pushing it very aggressively.
There was a development program going on within the corporate system saying, well, a little bit is good, but a lot more is much better, isn't it?
Public health departments staged demonstrations to convince the public of DDT's effectiveness and safety. Enthusiasm for the chemical knew no bounds, and few were questioning the wisdom of such use. Public places and private backyards were being treated whether people liked it or not. In 1957, planes sprayed a Massachusetts bird sanctuary owned by Olga Huckins, a friend of Carson's. In fury and desperation, Huckins told her what had happened. The birds showed all the symptoms typical of DDT poisoning. Huckins knew that the planes would be back in spite of her protests. She asked Carson for help. Carson later remembered how the thought of a spring silent of birdsong had moved her to action.
It was your personal letter to me that started it all. In it, you told what had happened and begged me to find someone in Washington who could help. It was in the course of finding that someone that I realized I must write the book.
We have to remember that children born today are exposed to these chemicals from birth, perhaps even before birth. Now, what is going to happen to them in adult life as a result of that exposure? We simply don't know.
This is one of the nation's best sellers, first printed on September 27, 1962.
In her groundbreaking book, Silent Spring, Rachel Carson jolted a prosperous post-war America, a country confident that science and technology were leading the way to a future in which disease and hunger could be overcome, in no small part thanks to a new generation of powerful pesticides. But in Silent Spring, Carson warned that progress had a price.
Can anyone believe it is possible to lay down such a barrage of poisons on the surface of the earth without making it unfit for all life?
While Carson didn't contend that chemical insecticides must never be used, she faced harsh opposition.
A spokesman for the chemical industry, Dr. Robert White Stevens.
The major claims in Miss Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, are gross distortions of the actual facts, completely unsupported by scientific experimental evidence and general practical experience in the field. If man were to faithfully follow the teachings of Miss Carson, we would return to the Dark Ages, and the insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth. Miss Carson maintains that the balance of nature is a major force in the survival of man, whereas the modern chemist, the modern biologist, the modern scientist believes that man is steadily controlling nature.
Now, to these people, apparently the balance of nature was something that was repealed as soon as man came on the scene. Well, you might just as well assume that you could repeal the law of gravity. The balance of nature is built of a series of interrelationships between living things and between living things and their environment. You can't just step in with some brute force and change one thing without changing a good many others. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that we must never interfere, that we must not attempt to tilt that balance of nature in our favor. But unless we do bring these chemicals under better control, we are certainly headed for disaster.
Rachel Carson's book and her courageous advocacy would help to launch the environmental movement. Still, most environmentalists would argue that today, a half-century later, we've yet to meaningfully address the problems of environmental toxins that she identified. Based on work he began as a student at Harvard Law School, Ralph Nader famously argued that the situation of drivers, the cars they drove in, the roads they drove on, not the disposition of drivers, was the cause of untold and needless suffering and death. Here's a brief account from Ralph Nader himself of the struggle that would transform auto safety, plus some suggestions about what his story from then might mean for law students today.
I lost friends on the highway in crashes. High school, college, couldn't believe it. It was like a bloodbath compared to today, your friends today. It's like 5 times more per capita, 5 times more per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. People were dying and injuring on the highway. So I decided to do something about it. And I got a hold of technical information and realized that the auto companies were not putting proven, simple safety features we now take for granted in their cars that were available for decades. Seat belts, padded dash panels, head restraints, stronger side impact, collapsing steering column so it doesn't turn into a spear in a left front collision, and airbags. GM got wind of this, and they hired a private detective to follow me everywhere. And the memo, after I sued them later, the memo that they instructed, the detective firm said to their allies, we got to get dirt on this guy in order to shut him up. First Amendment, right? Shut him up. It isn't just government that shuts people up. Corporations do a great job of it in the workplace and in the public arena. And they got caught because they followed me down to the U.S. Senate. I went into an elevator and went up, and the detective went down, and he lost me, and he went to the police guard, who happened to be a law student in those days. And you see this guy? And they caught him. I mean, you don't go around saying, I was following this. You know, like a brother cop, a brother detective. Now, the result was legislation was passed, make a long story short, over 1 million lives saved, tens of millions of injuries prevented, affected car production all over the world because they had to sell into our market in the U.S. and meet the standards. You see, if you go all the way back, what was the spark? Not only did I have a lucky choice of parents, the spark was finding out, why are my friends getting killed on the highway in low-speed crashes? Why did that car behave the way it did and became a spear or a fire trap when they could have built it better? So that's where you have to latch on to a big horizon as students. Have a higher estimate of your own significance. Watch the way you use your spare time. Watch your small talk. Watch how the forces on you will trivialize you year after year after year. Keep your eye on the big picture.
Notice that in both of these examples, the production and consumption of products by the very corporate entities and processes that had helped us win World War II were characterized as part of the problem, as too powerful, as untrustworthy, as out of sync with the interests of those they purport to serve. Carson and Nader, in other words, uncovered a kind of suffering or harm that had not been fully appreciated, and then showed how that harm was caused by powerful entities that manipulated government policy and distorted democracy without legitimacy. In doing so, they picked up the narrative that had informed the work of the muckrakers before the World Wars. In both cases, the efforts of these individuals would inspire the creation of a variety of institutions and regulatory agencies, like NHTSA and the EPA, all intended to give us more control over the situational factors that were posing such dangers. Another commonality to these achievements was that the authors came to their conclusions not by focusing on the law, but by focusing on problems. They took a problem-centric approach that began by their recognizing an immense problem that, for whatever reason, no one was talking about, much less doing something to address. As those scholars studied more closely, they began to notice the cycling causal interrelationships that generated the suffering and that were likely to intensify if not interrupted. Furthermore, they took up the issue in part because no one else was, and they were forced to confront significant attacks by the powerful entities that endeavored to undermine both their arguments and their credibility. These were common themes of the 1960s. Group after group began mobilizing to recognize sources of power and gain some for themselves. Existing distributions of wealth, privilege, power, and the like were widely perceived as unjust, reflecting illegitimate laws, customs, and other subtle situational forces and sources of power. The civil rights movement sought to expose inequalities and confront those in power in ways that rendered that power visible and undermined any claim that that power was legitimate. They could do so in part because the old blame frames were no longer legitimate, and the coercive power unleashed upon them were now viewed as illegitimate manifestations of prejudice, ignorance, and hate. Through such confrontations, the contrast between who we are and who we claim to be was brought into relief, as were the injustices that were baked into our system. Martin Luther King wrote, "A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth." Civil rights activists would often promote a situationist or systemic perspective regarding the causes and solutions to solve those injustices.
True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring.
Charity is not enough. Good intentions are not enough. The systems and structures that generate the inequalities have to be changed. In 1963, Betty Friedan, a writer for women's magazines with a background in psychology, published what many consider to be the seminal work of feminism's second wave. The feminine mystique gave voice to the unhappiness and frustration many women found in male-dominated society and helped motivate the political and social action that brought about many of the changes that followed. The publication of the feminine mystique was especially consequential for the advertising industry because Friedan placed much of the blame for women's unhappiness on America's post-war consumer society and especially on advertisers' exploitation of women. If they are not responsible for sending women home, they are surely responsible for keeping them there, she wrote. It is their millions which blanket the land with persuasive images, flattering the American housewife, diverting her guilt and disguising her growing emptiness. They have done this so successfully, employing the techniques and concepts of modern social science and transposing them into those deceptively simple, clever, and outrageous ads and commercials, that an observer of the American scene today accepts as fact that the great majority of American women have no ambition other than to be housewives. This clip captures some of the attitudes at the time.
Women's Liberation Day went largely unnoticed in San Francisco's middle-class neighborhoods, where housewives were too busy just being housewives to pay it all much mind.
I think it's ridiculous. I think it's stupid. I don't think women should just stay home all the time, but I don't think they belong out either.
I'm a very happy housewife and a very happy mother, and I feel I have so many things to do with my daughter, and Girl Scouts and PTA, and I think there's those kind of places for mothers.
Well, sometimes housework does get to be a hassle, and you do get frustrated, but you get over this.
So, in the 1960s, there were increasing numbers of women who were calling for equalization, even as there remained many who were resisting. Conceptions of who we are and what our institutions were doing to us were very much in flux, and the subject of tremendous debate and intense and often violent clashes. A common argument for all of these identity groups was as follows. Do not tell us that our disposition is defective or different, or that this inequality and our place is the neutral reflection of our disposition. We are suffering because of situational conditions, including laws, customs, and the stereotypes and prejudices that maintain them, that are designed as if to maintain these inequalities and keep us in our place, and that can be redesigned. There is illegitimate power generating inequality and yielding injustice. Justice requires that those laws and customs and institutions be reformed. Not just the critics and reformers who were relatively situationists. The attributions were catching on in the highest offices and the most elite policymaking arenas. In the early 1960s, LBJ promoted a set of situationist domestic programs that became known as his Great Society agenda. Two main goals of the Great Society's social reforms were the elimination of poverty and racial injustice. New major spending programs that addressed education, medical care, urban problems, and transportation were launched during this period. The Great Society in scope and sweep resembled the New Deal domestic agenda of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. To get some sense of the goals, take a look at the subjects of acts passed under his administration. And listen to the situationist account that he provides for racial inequalities.
To this end, equal opportunity is essential, but not enough. Not enough. Men and women of all races are born with the same range of abilities. But ability is not just the product of birth. Ability is stretched or stunted by the family that you live with and the neighborhood you live in, by the school you go to and the poverty or the richness of your surroundings. It is the product of 100 unseen forces playing upon the little infant, the child, and finally the man.
The old argument that the slum dweller makes the slum, or the person makes the situation, and that therefore we should not assist those who are living in poverty had been flipped on its head. In the 1960s, the dominant view had become that the situation, that is 100 unseen forces, makes the person, and that we should therefore be attentive to the situation. In the judiciary, we saw the same trend. We have come to recognize, he writes, that forces not within the control of the poor contribute to their poverty. More generally in this time period, the attributional tendencies of the judiciary was becoming more situationist, and the situationist judges were becoming more influential. But then again, it would also be during the 1960s, particularly in 1968, when the pressure for a new dispositionist attributional framework would gain momentum because of what might be called a big scare. It was in that time period that many experienced a tremendous threat. There were many associations, there were riots, there was growing polarization, anger, and fear. Many of the most powerful individuals, entities, and groups and institutions felt under threat. Indeed, large commercial interests were losing their legitimacy, having only just regained it during World War II, and were seen as significant contributors to many of the salient policy problems of the day. They were facing new regulations, expanding liability, and were increasingly vulnerable to other causes of action from a variety of stakeholders. Consequently, they were searching for a new and improved dispositionism, that is, a new way of filling that black box of the individual that would allow them to leave responsibility on the individual regarding salient inequalities, and that would help conceal or eclipse more subtle forms of power, and that would generally be legitimate even in the eyes of the have-nots. This video reviewed some of the effects of World War II on the blame frame crisis, how that crisis and changing perceptions of inequality, power, and legitimacy led many to perceive injustice in the 1960s, during what was probably the peak of the situationist thinking about policy problems and inequalities, and how that threatened certain interests, creating what might be called a big scare among large commercial interests, and finally how all of that heightened the effort toward creating a new, legitimate, effective blame frame.